Hello and welcome. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Megan Seipke Dame.
Hello, and my name is Erin Seipke Brown.
Today we're going to be going through an EIPA skill development mini lesson focusing on sentence boundaries. This is just our notice of intellectual property rights. We ask that you don't share the information from the PowerPoint with anybody who hasn't been part of this recorded lesson. Before we begin, we'd like to go ahead and tell you a little bit about who we are. Like I said, my name is Megan Seipke Dame. I graduated from the interpreter program at Madonna University in 2003. I actually dual degreed. I have a Bachelor of Science in Business Administration and a Bachelor of Arts in Sign Language Studies with a concentration in interpreting. I have been an educational interpreter now for about 20 years. And within the state of Michigan, I am credentialed as a standard level 2 interpreter, as well as an elementary standard level and a secondary standard level. I am nationally certified with both the RID NIC as well as the EdK 12. I hold a BEI advanced certification, and I have assessed both elementary and secondary PSE with the EIPA. I hold an elementary EIPA PSE 5.0 and a secondary PSE 4.6, and I passed the written test. Additionally, being here in the state of Michigan, I have an endorsement for medical mental health interpreting and in deafblind interpreting.
My credentials are very much the same as my sister's, with some small differences. I have been a full-time interpreter for approximately 21 years now. I completed my bachelor's degree in sign language studies from Madonna University in Livonia, Michigan in the year 2001. I currently hold an RID NIC and EdK 12 certification, as well as a BEI Advanced. My EIPA assessments, like Megan's, are both PSE. Uh, my elementary my elementary EIPA is a 4.5 and my secondary is a 4.4. I am currently, along with Megan, a student enrolled in the Masters of Interpreting Studies program at Western Oregon University, pursuing a master's degree in teaching interpreting, along with earning an additional graduate certificate in educational interpreting. Um, I also hold a state of Michigan endorsement for interpreting with those who are deafblind, an endorsement for working in medical mental health settings, and meet all of the requirements to work in educational settings, elementary and secondary, in the state of Michigan.
Okay, a little bit about the subskill for sentence boundaries. Within the EIPA report, there are a few different areas where this skill is going to be assessed. The EIPA report itself is broken down into 4 Romans. Roman 1 is evaluating your voice to sign skills. Roman 2 looks at sign to voice skills. Roman 3 is vocabulary, and Roman 4 is overall factors. If we break down and look at the skills that are evaluated under Roman 1, there is prosodic information, non-manual information, and interpreter performance. Sentence boundaries falls under the skill set with your prosodic information. Additionally, the non-manual information is going to include assessment based on the sentence types and whether or not clausal boundaries are indicated. Finally, the interpreter performance is looking at whether or not you have followed the grammar of either ASL or PSE. As such, all 3 of these subskills are going to be looking at your skill that includes sentence boundaries.
As we move to Roman 2, looking specifically at your interpreting product from sign into voice, we look at the subskills of sentence and clausal boundaries being indicated, sentence types being utilized, and the emphasis of important words, phrases, affect, and emotion, all within the topic of vocal and intonational features. These two are topics that will examine how you are using sentence boundaries.
Finally, we can look specifically at the skills assessed under Roman 4, the overall factors. If we look at what's assessed in the message clarity, does your interpretation follow the principles of discourse mapping? Discourse mapping is a very difficult skill to really pinpoint and improve because it involves all of the skills coming together while you are interpreting. If you look at any one interpreter's EIPA report, the lowest subskill on the report is almost always going to be following the principles of discourse mapping. Because we have this identified pattern within the EIPA report, we can start to understand that by isolating the skill of sentence boundaries and improving that one skill, we can then improve multiple subskills throughout the EIPA report, which will come together and have an overall improvement within our EIPA score.
The question then becomes, how do we work on isolating this particular skill, and what can we do to start improving that skill, refining that skill, or honing that skill in order to start seeing those improvements within our interpreting product, both from sign to voice and from voice to sign. In reports on the evaluation of the EIPA, we do know that because the majority of our work in classroom settings as educational interpreters is from voice into sign, we do know that more weight in the evaluation process is placed on our ability to interpret from English into the sign mode of choice on the assessment in order to reach our overall scores.
We're going to start with doing a little bit of discourse analysis and discussing exactly how sentence boundaries are actually marked. There are multiple tools or things within ASL that we do as a signer, as an interpreter or as a signer, that mark our sentence and utterance boundaries. Sometimes these are more pronounced, sometimes they are more subtle. An important distinction is going to be our sentence boundaries are going to be marked a little bit more clearly and a little bit more pronounced when we are interpreting compared to when we are signing. The difference is that when we are just signing, conversing with people, it is very organic language. They are my thoughts and they are my ideas and it is my discourse. So how I mark those utterance boundaries belong to me. However, in an interpreted dialogue, I am no longer the originator of the message. I am taking somebody else's message given in the source language and I am now changing it and putting it into the target language. What ends up happening then is I have to apply those sentence boundaries to make the target message clear based on what was given within the source language. As such, in order to make those boundaries within both the utterances and the sentences clear, they're going to have to be a little bit more pronounced. This is to help avoid things like run-on sentences and to help improve the clarity of the message.
The types of markers that we utilize in order to indicate boundaries of our sentences, of clauses, and of phrases are something like dropped or folded hands, a head nod or a head tilt, pauses, lengthening of the sign, shifts in our eye gaze or in the aperture of our eye gaze, and brow movements.
Let's take a closer look at what each one of these things may look like. dropped or folded hands. When we are interpreting or we are signing, obviously there's going to be movement and gesture within what we're doing. If I'm signing and then I bring my hands together and fold them, or I drop them all together, that is an indication that that utterance or that sentence has ended, and the signer, myself, is now moving on to a new sentence or a new topic.
One of the differences in how we determine whether or not dropping our hands or folding our hands is more appropriate often has to do with the topic that we are currently using or talking about. If we are moving from one sentence to another within a topic, we may choose to just fold our hands and then move on to the next sentence. However, if we are moving from one topic to another topic, at that point we would choose to drop our hands as an indication that that topic has concluded and we're ready to move on to the next one.
It's also important to note that the dropping of the hands may or may not be one hand or both hands. It could be that you are interpreting and then you drop one hand, or it could be that you drop two. In the instances of topic changes, typically the natural inclination is to have a bigger marker at the change of topic. If it's the end of the sentence, that hand drop or folded hands will likely be less pronounced than it is if you are completely changing topics.
Moving to our next marker is a head nod or a head tilt. And this would actually truly look like either a nod or a tilt.
And again, the pronounced movement will be lessened when it is more of a sentence boundary or an utterance boundary compared to a complete topic change and sentence boundary.
As we examine each of these markers, one other important item of note is to recognize that very frequently these particular markers are not used in isolation. Most commonly, you will see a combination of multiple markers used simultaneously. If we're looking at the example of dropping hands and a head nod or a head tilt, it could look as pronounced as you're signing and you have your head up and you're looking at the person with whom you're interpreting. When you're done, dropping your hands and tilting your head down in order to bring a full topic to a close before beginning the next one.
The next item is pauses. And as it suggests, it's literally taking a pause within the conversation and then resuming. As Erin mentioned, these are not typically found in isolation, but rather a combination of multiple markers. The stronger the markers, the more significant the change in sentence or topic. Sign lengthening is one of those boundaries that can be a little bit less pronounced. If I am signing, what that means, that sign lengthening, is I literally hold the end sign for a little bit longer before moving on to the next utterance. This would very likely be used along with a pause. If I am holding the end sign, there is a pause then before I continue.
One classic example that helps illustrate pauses and sign lengthening together is the use of if-then statements. If something happens, then what would happen next? And we would hold the if in order to emphasize that. We would lengthen the sign. There would be a pause in between the if part of the statement and the second then part of the statement.
Another example would be when asking a question. Why? So not only is the sign being held, but I'm also holding and waiting before proceeding.
Additionally, if you analyze the production of Megan's signing of the question why, you will also see an incorporated head tilt with that as she leaned forward. This is a perfect example of how we see multiple markers being used in conjunction with each other in order to emphasize there is a boundary of a clause, phrase, or sentence.
To complicate the overlap between different utterance boundaries as well, we have the shift in eye gaze or the aperture. Aperture refers to the size of the eyes. We can widen them or we can close them. So that movement is the aperture. We can also use a shift in eye gaze. If I'm speaking with somebody and I look down and then look back, oftentimes this can be marking the end of an utterance or a sentence. Going back to my example of questions, we see that aperture used frequently. If it's why versus why, the change in aperture is going to change the meaning of the sign, but it's also going to help mark the boundaries of that question.
The last marker that we're going to talk about is brow movement. It's very difficult to incorporate brow movement without incorporating a shift in eye gaze or aperture. Our eyes typically will work in conjunction with our eyebrows. Our eyebrows, whether we move them up or furrow them, will help mark where our sentence and clausal and phrasal boundaries are. Using Megan's example of asking why as a rhetorical question, and these go up, and then there is a pause, or why, and there's a furrow indicating I'm asking you the question why, and then there is a pause.
So as you can see, there is going to be overlap and there's going to be instances where multiple sentence and utterance boundary markers are used in order to emphasize whatever topic it is or the question that's involved. We would be remiss if we did not discuss the importance of punctuation as part of our sentence and utterance boundaries. English has a full cadre of punctuation marks that indicate how language is being used, whether it's a period or a question mark. That changes whether it's a statement or a question. We use exclamation marks for emphasis. We use commas to indicate pauses. We use ellipses to draw out suspense.
We may use parentheses in order to insert a side comment or a clarifying comment.
The trick then is how we take these English markings and these English parameters and all of these functions of the English language and incorporate them and make sure that they are clear within an interpretation when working from English into ASL. It can have serious implications if we misplace that punctuation as we are working from the source language into the target language. If we look at the very first example on this list, $25 bills versus $25 bills. If we were doing, say, a math class, this could have very different responses and understandings and therefore answers. To have $25 bills is very different than saying, I have $25 bills. The
If
next
we
example, go ahead.
If we move on to the second example that we have, I want to thank my parents Denise and God, versus I want to thank my parents, Denise, and God. By applying commas in different places or not applying a comma, in the first part of the sentence, one could infer that parents are named Denise and God, whereas in the second part of the sentence, we would assume this to mean you're thanking three different entities: parents, Denise, and God. How we would interpret those two based on the pauses indicated by those commas would appear very different. Compared to
As we can see, those are two incredibly different interpretations. While this specific example may be a little bit haha cute because
tongue in cheek.
who would think that, Denise and God are somebody's parents? But we use this example to illustrate a point. It could very well be that the person is thanking parents, a sister, and a brother, parents, an aunt and an uncle, parents, a friend, a godparent. It could be any combination of individuals. As the interpreter, we don't necessarily know who those individuals are, but we do have the responsibility of navigating that source message and producing it appropriately into a target message. It could very well be that the person doing the thanking has deaf parents in the audience. And if we misinterpret that information, then the message is going to be lost.
If we then take a look at the third example, I'm sorry I love you versus I'm sorry I love you, the use of the semicolon indicates where a pause should happen. The meaning of the first part of that comparison is an apology for the feelings of love.
Or
As
it could even be an interpretation of regret for loving somebody.
Conversely, if we then look at the second one, we can see that it is both an apology and a declaration of love for somebody. While in print, any of these three examples that we've provided becomes relatively clear that $25 bills and $25 bills are very different and they indicate different things. When we are interpreting in a classroom setting, we don't necessarily, in most cases, have the benefit of seeing the sentences, seeing the punctuation in print. Rather, we are listening to discourse. We are identifying the pauses within the English discourse, and we are needing to then render those pauses accurately in the correct places, in the correct ways in our ASL interpretation.
One of the toughest challenges that we face as educational interpreters, especially if our first native language is English and our target second learned language is ASL, is taking what we know in English and making it clear within the context of our target language. When we think about English and how it's used throughout educational discourse, these kind of examples are not going to be limited to things like your English and language arts classes. These are going to transfer over to things like science and social studies and even mathematics. The language used in mathematics is English all of its own. There is very specific language used, especially when we start looking at things like story problems. A lot of English language users struggle with story problems, even though they have fluency in the English language, because the application is so incredibly different. If we have trouble understanding the meaning within the source language, we will obviously then struggle to convert that equitably and understandably and clearly into the target language.
Depending on the speed and clarity of the delivered discourse, we will have additional complications in trying to render that information accurately.
Let's take a look at this on a little bit larger scale. This is a short paragraph where all of the capitalization and punctuation has been removed. We can see from the two examples that follow that depending on where the punctuation and capitalization is used, we can take the same words and drastically change the meaning of the utterance itself. In the first example, we can see something a little bit more positive. I would like to apply for a job with your business. For 2 years, I have been employed as a sales clerk for the Davis Group. I sold nothing that I did not take pride in. I am sure it will be the same if I work for you. Conversely, we can see the negative connotations given as we move some of that punctuation and capitalization in the second example. I would like to apply for a job with your business for 2 years. I have been employed. As a sales clerk for the Davis Group, I sold nothing. That I did not take pride in. I am sure it will be the same if I work for you.
While again, these two examples seem perhaps a little bit extreme, they do illustrate for us the point that the application of pauses and phrases and sentence boundaries within a piece of discourse does have very significant impacts on the meaning of the discourse that is being delivered. If we take a look at the very first example on this slide, however, where all of the punctuation has been removed, we want you to consider what this may translate to if you were to listen to this in spoken discourse. I would like to apply for a job with your business for 2 years. I have been employed as a sales clerk for the Davis Group. I sold nothing I did not take pride in. I'm sure it will be the same if I work for you. Sometimes we end up hearing something like this, and we would refer to this as word salad. Everything runs together. There is no indication of phrases, clauses, or sentences, and we really cannot make meaning necessarily out of this string of words and syllables that are thrown together without applying the things that give it the meaning. When we mentioned just a short time ago how the speed of the discourse that is being delivered can have an impact on the meaning of that discourse, this is an example of what we may mean by that. As discourse is sped up, we tend to lose, especially the pauses in that discourse, where we would see commas, where we would see colons and semicolons, where we would hear the emphasis that indicates that this is a period sentence versus a question or an exclamation. And because of the speed of the discourse that is being delivered in English, and the removal of those indicators within the source message, it makes it virtually impossible then for us to deliver accurately and meaningfully in our target language.
One of the instances where this kind of example becomes incredibly pertinent is when a class is doing a read aloud. Things like popcorn reading where one student starts reading from a textbook and then stops so that another student can continue, and then another, and then another. This kind of activity is incredibly difficult for the educational interpreter. A, because it can be very difficult to hear the students as the sound moves from around the classroom. Varying degrees of reading fluency, and whether or not students are even just audible because of the volume. One common way of navigating this kind of activity then is for the interpreter to get a copy of the book. And as the students are taking turns reading around the room, the interpreter will actually look at the book and go through him or herself as the students are reading. Now, the thing that we have to consider in this instance is that the interpreter is now relying on the printed text rather than the reading of the students around the room. It might look something like this. As the interpreter, I am looking at the book and the print in front of me rather than at the student. I'm not listening to the reading as it goes around the room per se. I am looking at the print text. This sight translation is not necessarily giving an equivocal message. Meanwhile, I am also losing many of the different aspects of ASL that makes an interpreted or a signed message clear. I am not maintaining any kind of eye gaze with the student because I'm looking at the book. As such, I am losing all of my facial aspect, and I'm also not including things like sentence and utterance boundaries. I am going word for word, but I'm not necessarily taking in all of the meaning. I'm not using things like using a hand drop or um, any of the other boundaries. Um, I have lost the ability to use eye gaze because I'm staring at a book. I've lost the ability to use a head tilt or a head drop because I'm looking at the book.
Unfortunately, then, what we end up seeing happening while we apply this technique as a tool to hopefully improve the access to the information and improve our ability to interpret what is being read from the book, we are actually then delivering a message that is equally as difficult to make meaning from as simply trying to follow what is being said around the room as popcorn reading.
Fortunately, we can use deliberate practice to help improve this skill. Deliberate practice is a methodology, a pedagogy to skill development that is very structured. It involves using a defined set of stimulus material, for example, the paragraph that we have provided here or some of the sentences that we have provided as an example. It involves giving yourself a timeline, developing a specific measurable goal. One of the important things is that the skill is broken down into basic steps. Just as we talked before about the various sentence boundaries rarely being used in isolation, understand that the building blocks to interpreting are almost never used in isolation. However, as we are looking at skill development, the smaller the unit of the interpreting skill that we can find, the better we can start to hone those interpreting skills.
So then, as we talk about indicating sentence boundaries, and then also phrasal and clausal boundaries, what does it look like to develop a plan of deliberate practice for this particular skill? If we look again at the sentences that were shared in comparison on one of our earlier slides, What we can start by doing is drafting comparisons in the two parts of the sentence. 20 $25 bills versus $25 bills. In looking at those, notice that they are not sentences and they do not have any additional context. They are simply two different phrases with essentially 3 words each. So, in order to start then working on deliberate practice, what are the different ways I could use to convey these concepts from English into sign language? I say sign language instead of ASL because depending on the mode of communication chosen for an EIPA test, you may use manually coded English, you may use PSE, or you may use ASL. It's important to note, though, that there is not necessarily only one right way to sign something. So, what are the different ways you could convey each of these two ideas accurately? We might sign we might sign there's different approaches. We would then too look at $25 bills and identify what are the different ways that we could sign that particular concept. Multiple different ways. Once we have figured out for ourselves what is the way that I want to sign this particular concept, we would then take this word and put it into a sentence. I need to go to the bank and get $25 bills. And we would practice doing that. In the process of doing that, it's important that we can see what it is we're doing. It's important to recognize that when we're talking about our own organic, natural language, we know what is happening with the message that we want to convey cognitively. Once I have output that language, whether it's speaking in English or whether it is signing it, I do not necessarily have evidence to know what I stated, what I signed, was accurate and did convey the same message that I understood cognitively. In order to have that, we need a permanent record of what was said or what was signed. Fortunately, with technology being what it is now, everybody with a cell phone has a camera and a video recorder handy and easy to use. And it is our recommendation that as you engage in deliberate practice, that you take advantage of that tool and make a recording of what it is that you're doing. Have a written recording of the statement or utterance that you're planning on working on, so that when you are finished, you have both your written sentence and you have a video of your sign, so that you can analyze and compare those two things to figure out, was this the statement that I thought it was? Was it accurate? Which part of this did I feel was not accurate, was not correct, or could have been clearer? And then make adjustments as you continue to practice that same sentence repeatedly, making a new video each time so that you can analyze your work, make adjustments, and improve.
This works in multiple ways as well. If you find some stimulus material, working from something in print means that you're working from something that is concrete. You can see it and it doesn't change. It is going to be the same stimulus material every time you revisit it during your course of deliberate practice. When we start moving to what we hear, that's when our stimulus material starts to become more ephemeral. If I'm sitting in a classroom, I hear it once and then it's gone. I don't have the benefit of hearing it over and over and over again. We can compensate for that during our deliberate practice by making a recording of what it is that we're planning on listening to. That way, as we revisit the stimulus material throughout the course of our deliberate practice, that spoken language becomes less ephemeral and more concrete. That gives us the tool by which we measure our progress. For example, if I want to make note of the various pauses within an utterance, I can make a recording and listen to it. I can jot down how many times am I hearing a pause within this utterance. Then, when I move to my interpretation of listening to that stimulus material and producing an interpretation from it, I can then watch my video back and make note. Did I put some sort of utterance boundary in each place where I heard that pause? Do those two markers match up? If they do not, is there a reason? Is it something that I need to work on? This way we have something ephemeral, but now it is more concrete, and that will help support our plan of deliberate practice. So we start at the phrasal level, then we work up to the sentential level. Then we can start working up to say something as long as an utterance or a paragraph. But also we are working from print first, and then we are working toward what we can hear.
If we then take a look too at working from ASL or signed language into English, we can follow a similar practice. If we find a piece of video discourse that we want to use as our stimulus material, we can either look at a small portion of that, which would equate to a sentence. We can analyze that sentence for understanding, and then we make an audio sample of our interpretation of that ASL sentence. We can then take a look at the sentence and count, where do we hear a pause? Where do we see a pause? Where do we see hands dropping or folding? Where do we notice a change in eye aperture or an eye gaze? Where do we see marking of the brows? Count those different pieces within the video discourse. Then listen to your audio interpretation. Do you hear a pause at each one of those markers as appropriate? You can then move from the sentential level to seeing a small piece of discourse, what would be equivalent to a paragraph or a short story, and do the same process. Mark the different types of markers that you're seeing in that piece of discourse. Am I seeing nods? Am I seeing brows? Am I seeing dropped or folded hands? Make your interpretation and listen to that. Does it sound like a cohesive piece of interpreted text? Do you hear sentences? Do you hear questions? Do you hear exclamations? Do you hear pauses? Does what you hear match what you saw?
If we go back to the short paragraph that we have as an example here, and if we look at the middle selection, which is the more positive, upbeat version that you would expect to kind of hear in a job interview, I would like to apply for a job with your business. That is a statement. It is positive. And at the end of business, there is a period. As such, if we were to interpret this sentence, At the end of that, I might hold business. There's a little bit of a head tilt, eye aperture, and eyebrow raise. I am telling the person, okay, um, either either way, if you're looking at the more PSE version of the transliteration or the ASL interpretation, both of those sentences at the end are going to incorporate these utterance boundaries. Moving on to the next sentence. For 2 years, I have been employed as a sales clerk for the Davis Group. Okay? Again, it's very natural that the final sign is held briefly after that has been signed. And again, we start seeing things like a little bit of a head tilt and eyebrow raise, slight enlarging in the aperture. I sold nothing that I did not take pride in. Okay? Again, each utterance typically will see a combination of the different markers. The final sentence says, I am sure it will be the same if I work for you.
If we take a look at the final paragraph, the one that we wouldn't necessarily think that we were going to hear, the one that seems a bit more negative, I would like to apply for a job with your business for 2 years. I have been employed. As a sales clerk for the Davis Group, I sold nothing. That I did not take pride in. I am sure it will be the same if I work for you.
In both instances, even with the connotation changing from something more positive to something decidedly more negative, we still see the incorporation of boundaries that are marking the end of each sentence. The change is going to be in where they are placed. Again, if we're working from print, this is when we have a decidedly more difficult task at hand, because when we are taking a message from English and interpreting it into ASL, we're dealing with not only a difference in sentences and utterances, but we're dealing with different grammar. There are going to be instances where we take the source message from English and we have to put, say, the sentence that was uttered last first. So we have to change around the order of the sentences. This is one of the reasons why sight translation is so difficult, because the interpreter, when working from print, is usually going word for word for word. If I were to take these sentences and work word to word as I would from a textbook, we know that ASL will typically eliminate words like the when working from English to ASL. And we will still see that happen when an interpreter is working from something in print. The difficulty is that we are eliminating some words from that paragraph, but we're not doing anything to support meaning transfer. We're giving word, 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 but just like reading it in one fell swoop in a sentence is word salad, now all we're doing is we're giving sign salad.
And whether we are using ASL or PSE or a manually coded English, the difference between having a meaningful signed utterance and having word salad is the indication of the boundaries between phrases and clauses and sentences that allow our language processing to find a chunk of words that are strung together in order to create a set of words that have meaning, and how this set of words that has meaning and this set of words that have meaning are connected to create greater meaning with each other.
Correct. Regardless of the target language, what's important is that the grammar is visually accessible and present. If we look back at the EIPA report and where the skill of sentence boundaries is measured, looking again at Roman 4 overall factors, within that skill of message clarity, following the principles of discourse mapping. When we are mapping our discourse, we are plotting the path to a clear message. How am I organizing the information within space to maximize the ability for a student to understand what that utterance is? If I'm talking about applying for this job, I want to make it clear that I am the applicant, you have the job that I'm applying for, and yes, I have other experience, and that was in the past. I need to make sure that each of these components is represented clearly. Again, if my target modality is PSE, it's going to look different than the target language of ASL. However, I am still making sure that my sentence and clausal boundaries are present and that it helps clarify the message. I'm making sure that the sentence types are being represented. If a person is speaking and it's a statement, it should look like a statement, or it should sound like a statement. If it's a question, it should look like a question, or it should sound like a question. One of the things that Erin mentioned earlier is voice inflection. If the source language is a signed language and it is not intended to be a question, one of the important aspects of our job as the interpreter is to make sure that that distinction is made. Oftentimes, when we are unsure of the message that we are producing in the target language, especially if working from a signed language into a spoken language, we have a tendency to uptick our voice at the end. And when we uptick, it sounds like a question. If the utterance itself is a statement and not a question, we need to be cognizant of that so that we don't add an uptick at the end. This is helping to ensure that our interpreter product, our sentence type, is accurately being represented. We still need to make sure that important words and phrases and affect and emotion are all there. That affect includes whether or not we are asking a question or we are saying something that is a statement or an exclamation.
In order to make sure that we're doing this correctly and accurately and effectively, this is where we would be applying that list of non-manual boundary markers that we talked about when we first started. the use of our eyebrows to indicate whether something is a topic or a question, the aperture of our eyes and our eye gaze, how we're folding our hands or dropping our hands, how we're nodding our heads, tilting our heads. All of these things come together to help indicate whether an utterance is a sentence or an exclamation or a question. These things help us indicate if we are pausing because this is a phrase and I'm going to be moving on. All of these add a level of clarity to the discourse that makes our overall interpretation more clear, more cohesive, and more effective, improving the discourse mapping that we're striving for.
Thank you so much for joining us for this EIPA skill development mini lesson on sentence boundaries. If you have any questions, we would always encourage and welcome your direct contact. Our contact information is listed on the very first slide. Our email addresses are there, and you are welcome to contact us with questions pertaining to today's mini lesson.
In addition to the mini lesson and the incorporated slides, you also should have received a copy of the PowerPoint which has been provided to your instructors. Thank you so much for joining us for this mini lesson, and we will see you at the next one.
Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye.